District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. And it's so great to revisit with you. It was a lot of fun recording with you at your beautiful ranch on the Colorado-Wyoming border. And listeners will get to know more about your story in a forthcoming Conservation Nation episode we did. But for people maybe unfamiliar with your organization, you, and the situation playing out in Wyoming, could you explain briefly what that all is about? Give some context if you can.
Yeah. So 4 years ago, I started the Albany County Conservancy. I'm 56 years old, and I'm a fourth generation Wyomingite that grew up here in Wyoming. And we're at a very special time in our existence as a state. Things are changing rapidly here. And there's a lot of concern regarding wildlife, ecosystems, habitat, historic sites. And so it seemed like a good time when COVID-19 hit that I might have time to set up a 501c3 and start to do the things that I've always wanted to do before I get too old and before I get to that point where I can't involve others and infuse my energy into this. So we received our nonprofit in 2020, and it's been fast and furious ever since. And some of the background about my family settled in the Laramie Basin area, which is the eastern section of the Rocky Mountain ecosystem, in 1905. And my family owns and operates the oldest downtown Wyoming business, which happens to be a photography business. So I'm sure that is why I love vistas and wildlife and historic sites. I grew up photographing generational ranch families.
And you have a studio right in the heart of downtown Laramie.
I do. It's on the busiest corner in the downtown area. And Laramie is a city that is 30,000 people.
Backdropped by the University of Wyoming, if people aren't aware. But it's a very charming little town.
And it's surrounded. So what makes Laramie so special? So Laramie Basin is surrounded by 4 large mountain ranges. So you really do understand migratory wildlife when you live in Laramie. Even if you work in downtown, even if you're a professor of economics or mathematics, you don't have to be an outfitter or a hunter and fisherman to understand you have migratory wildlife literally right in your front or backyard.
It's a beautiful region, and anyone could see that for themselves. When we were filming with one of your fellow participants on his ranch, when we were entering, we saw a beautiful big herd of pronghorn sheep. So there's plenty of wildlife to go around in that particular region, which is why I know you're concerned about this proliferation of onshore wind. So specifically, could you speak to your organization and the concerns it has with the various projects being proposed or perhaps greenlit? And how many projects are currently being proposed? Like, what's the magnitude that should worry people from inside Wyoming and outside Wyoming?
Well, so shortly after we received our 501c3 standing, people started showing up at my business, voicing their concerns. And I then received a letter because my homestead sits on the Wyoming-Colorado state line. I received a letter from the Colorado community saying you are going to be 5 miles from an industrial wind energy project. That area, it has a major Western Area Power Association power line. And I had just cut a Christmas tree there, and I had viewed a herd of elk, and there were 500 elk in that herd. And so I immediately read that letter trembling and told my husband, that's not where you put that. And he said, but you can't fight this. And I said, I don't know if I'm using the term fight yet, but I can go to the public scoping meeting. So I went to the scoping meeting, and many people would tell you no one was able to ask a question. They were informed that after the Energy Commission talked to them, they could go talk to a representative from the proponent. So that's the developer of the project. And then they pointed to two very youthful looking young adults, one in each corner kind of thing. So that was upsetting to me. Fast forward now, 4.5 years, 5 years later, I am aware of 21 approved industrial wind energy projects in my county. So the cumulative contiguous impacts to my wildlife, I actually experience every day, as do the families I photograph. In my county, we have 3 wildlife preserves. We have Bamforth National Wildlife Refuge. That's 5 miles from my studio. We have Hunton National Bird Refuge. That is 8 miles south of my studio. We have Morton Lake National Refuge. We have National Historic Landmarks in my county, one of which is one of the most significant historic landmarks in the nation. It's the Ames National Historic Landmark. We call it Ames Monument. It's a granite pyramid on the highest point on the Transcontinental Railroad. And it is surrounded with these mountain vistas. And to me, it's dear to my heart because it represents the connection of the East and West Coast after a very troubling time when we fought our fellow Americans. More Americans died during the Civil War than any other war we've ever participated in. And we wanted to connect. We didn't want to have to sail from the East to the West Coast. We wanted to connect in a more rapid way. We wanted to start the healing. We wanted to be a nation again. And the Ames Monument was designed by 3 internationally acclaimed architects. And so it's awe-inspiring. And that monument will be surrounded by wind turbines now. And there are 479 nationally significant historic sites in that area as identified by the Western Area Power Association. There are actually more than that, but that's what, after 4.5 years of participating in the National Historic Preservation Act, that's what people were able to accomplish to get that acknowledged in something called Section 106, which is focused on historic mitigation. And that's one project. We have 9 wind projects north of that that sit in the middle of indigenous tribal burial sites. It's just overwhelming what's happening. We are killing protected species in this county daily. Golden eagles do not do well with wind and transmission lines. And we have both. The West-Wide Energy Corridor, the section not far from us that sits in Carbon County should never have been built. And so I really started to feel this heavy burden from my friends and my family, my clients telling me, hey, other conservation groups, ones that have been around for 50 years plus, they're turning a blind eye to this issue. So I put up billboards posing a rhetorical question, why wind here? I didn't even say if I was for or against, and I could get no local press to discuss that. I did have international press reach out to me because of those billboards, but that doesn't do much change when you need it at the county and state level. And then, of course, my members went to the local newspaper and they put, letters into the editor and they wrote op-eds. But the coverage, if there was coverage in the paper, very often, it was copied and pasted from the energy developer's website, which is a skewed viewpoint. And I can understand, because if you're a new journalist, it's pretty intimidating writing an article on energy in an energy state. And so you might do that. So over the years now, the Albany County Conservancy is, lobbying and educating and doing all these things in addition to meeting federal deadlines, getting comments in before comment periods close. It's a very frantic time for us.
Yes, and you have so many moving parts, and I know we'll try to get the video out in a timely fashion. It just takes a little bit on our end, but it really is such an important story because it's not an isolated case. And it seems like actually Wyoming is being pummeled with all these different projects more than any other state, even like states that are very receptive, so to speak, to wind energy. Why is it that Wyoming isn't getting more attention for this? Because people are noticing, I mean, for more context with wind, rather, wind generation is down for the first time in several decades. So the wind is not blowing. So a lot of people should start to question, is that really something you want to explore? There are other perhaps more safer means of extracting energy and producing and generating electricity. So wind generation is down. Why do they want to scale up the projects? They occupy so much land, countless thousands of acres upon thousands, and you never get that land back. And even though everyone knows these kinds of impacts in data, they still are, no, we got to go through with this. And even if the threat posed by these structures impacts wildlife or historical monuments, it seems like they don't care. How are you trying to make people in your immediate area care and to value, the landscapes and kind of those wild qualities of Wyoming still?
Well, some of the interesting things that have really hit me between the eyes are that I was just, for example, in a national publication because the Bureau of Land Management added the state of Wyoming and the state of Utah and some other states in the solar
Western Solar Plan.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So they've opened up 3.8 million acres in Wyoming in the wrong places for solar because they are claiming it is gray. So in other words, there's development there. There is development all over Wyoming. We have oil, gas, coal, wind, solar. We also sit in that eastern section of the Rocky Mountains. We have been harboring the biodiversity of the United States for decades. We have more wildlife than any of the other states. I haven't lived in Alaska to be able to state that, but I have visited other states. I look at wildlife data all the time. I don't think most people see 500 elk in the state they live in because they have more people than we do. We are the least populated state. And we just happen to be in a high desert ecosystem that's very important to the Eastern Flyway. It is very important in a migratory zone. We know that mule deer in Wyoming travel up to 500 miles here. So when you place wrongly sited industrial green energy, they don't like that. So that does not help them. We see that the antelope populations, getting to the conversation about the property you went to, that they died of some flu-like respiratory illness a year ago, and the numbers were devastating. But if you're a stressed population, your health isn't good either when you're traveling to avoid these things and you're trying to travel to have your youth avoid these things. We're seeing horrific tolls being taken on populations like golden eagles. Golden eagles are protected. In the United States, it's against the law to kill bald and golden eagles. Yet wind developers can apply for something called an eagle take. But in Wyoming, we're seeing that projects just on their own in my county are exceeding eagle take. And that's very alarming. So there are a lot of things that are unique about Wyoming. There are also challenges. In that article where I'm quoted, I talked to that reporter and I was told, I have to be careful, Anne. We can't focus on Wyoming too much because every time I do, although it's dear to my heart, I'm told, I'm scrutinized for covering news about what's happening in Wyoming. So I look at that and I think maybe that's happening in the press because maybe that syndicated news outlet feels maybe the rest of the United States isn't as wired to Wyoming. Maybe their readers want to see news elsewhere. Maybe they'd rather read about concerns, off of the shore of Nantucket or, things in other parts of the US, but wildlife's wildlife when you're talking about avian wildlife. Historic sites are historic sites. And now I've heard that Section 106 is being streamlined. And so by doing so, we've learned that with eagle rules, we've learned that with these solar and transmission line environmental impact processes. They're being fast-tracked and streamlined because they don't want public input in this process. They want to remove transparency. It's getting more and more challenging. Deadlines are just everywhere for everyone. Everyone who's a biologist, everyone who cares, everyone who's a conservationist. You're not just submitting public comment in regards to one thing. You very often have a stack of stuff on your desk and you have a truncated timeline you've been given, and you have 30 days, not business days, but days. And 3 and 4 things pop up at one time. And that's with intent.
If you're able to share or comfortable sharing, what is your organization doing that my listeners should be aware of? How are you guys responding? And are your concerns, lawsuits, or other maneuvers being taken seriously or considered?
Well, so I take that view of taken seriously. I mean, my concerns as a nonprofit are very serious. And so we filed a petition in our district federal court because the Bureau of Land Management failed to notify the public in our state. So that should send out warning signals to anybody anywhere in the US that has public land. Because are you being notified about everything? I tend to think in Wyoming, we're very blessed. I'm on the busiest corner in Laramie. Laramie is the only town of higher education. We have the University of Wyoming. Wyoming, we have one university, a land grant university. I am just a 45-minute drive from my state capital. I am an epicenter of activity, and most of my clients, being a 118-year-old business in Wyoming, they're connected on political level. They are connected on maybe a small business ownership level. It's a lot easier to be a big fish in a small pond than be a small fish in a big pond. So I tend to know things when they hit immediately. So if this is happening and I caught this in my state, what is happening in your state that you didn't catch? Because it's kind of hard to catch. I sent the Bureau of Land Management letters for 2 years, and they told me, no, that project is not a federal nexus. Yes, it was. So now what we're dealing with when I look at Ames Monument is I've now devoted time monthly to meetings for years. And I've sat in on that mitigation, and there was no mitigation. There was no open communication. There's a wonderful thing online called A Citizen's Guide to Section 106, which says you as a American citizen can participate in historic site protection. So if you have a historic site that's threatened, you can follow this process. You can talk to your county, you can talk to your state, you can talk to your federal government. No, you couldn't. We were not allowed to talk during those Zoom meetings. There never was an in-person meeting. They never itemized all our historic sites in a process called Hobbs Harris. There were lots of things wrong with what I experienced. And as a representation of the public voice, because I'm a nonprofit, so I represent hundreds of members, I was able to write letters in that process, because that's part of that legal process, and say, you truncated this deadline. You aren't extending the deadline. You're not allowing us to speak. Sending a doodle poll, controlling the narrative does not allow for transparent, open communication. I was allowed to do that because of that process. If you are funding nonprofits, and I say this earnestly, start to see where they've advocated for the things you care about, because what we're seeing nationally is a lot of nonprofits that get a lot of donor money aren't advocating. They're putting out calendars. They're talking about, the low numbers of wildlife. But when was the last time they advocated in an area of concern? When was the last time they participated in this open, transparent public process? And so that's of concern, because if you're funding those groups, is your funding really doing the muscle that you want it to do? And that's where small nonprofits tend to be lean, and they tend to care, and they are focused, especially if they're newer, because they see a gap. I saw a gap. That's why I jumped in, is to be a part of positive change.
And you have done a lot for someone of your stature, and really had made a lot of noise.
It's horrific what's happening. And people think it's all an organized effort. It's not. It's not. It's what we're seeing on a national level or a state level or a county level. It's chaos, and that's why this has to happen. So what we're seeing with the Rail Tie Wind Project, that I've been participating in historic mitigation, is that after a year and a half of silence, no meetings held by the federal agency in charge, which is the Western Area Power Association, that we had a meeting in April that said, here is the historic property treatment plan. You're going to have an exhibit at your state museum. So the Albany County Conservancy, my nonprofit, submitted a letter that said that is not in the area of impact. Why did I say that? Because when you read Section 106 law, mitigation, when it's looked at, should be addressing the area of impact. My state museum is not in the county that Rail Tie Wind is in. So that was upsetting. Why did that? Why? We hadn't even discussed that. For 4 years, we had talked about mitigation in the area of impact, a scenic trail for the public, documenting the historic sites, a migrations museum in the area of impact. People had all these different ideas. We were never allowed enough time to discuss those. We being the consulting parties, whether that was the Wyoming Archaeological Group or the nonprofit, the Alliance for Historic Wyoming, or our county local government group, the Albany County Historic Preservation Board. We were never allowed to have those constructive conversations. According to Section 106, consultation is to occur until all of other avenues have been exhausted, so that we mitigate the impacts. That didn't occur. And then what's more disturbing is, in my letter, I noted that consulting parties were excluded from consultation. So I received a reply back that stated that we were not excluded from consultation, that consultation was strictly being held with the agencies involved in treatment plan 1 and 2. So that would be my state historic preservation office, because that had to do with the state museum exhibit. And that would be my state parks and historic trails, because they are treatment plan 2, which means they are receiving money to put signage up at my monument and to do maintenance. And that is extremely troubling to the hundreds of people I represent. Signage is not mitigation. And there was signage there. And our state historic, our state trails and our state parks and trails office took the signage down because they put a handicap accessible ramp around that monument, and to make it the first handicapped accessible monument in the country, I believe. So they knew they had to put it back up. So they should already have state funding in place for that. And I would hope, since they're in charge of that historic landmark, they know that they need to maintain it. So it gets to then, is this a bribe? Is this a bribe in the treatment plan? Is this a bribe to a pet project to fund a Wyoming exhibit at our state museum? The Ames Monument had to do with the Transcontinental Railroad. That is not what treatment plan 1 is stating. It's stating it will be a Wyoming exhibit. We have a lot of Wyoming historic exhibits that exist in our state. So that's of concern. And then again, just because there might be monetary compensation to place signage or whatever, if it's just given to my state parks and historic trails, I have no control on how they utilize that or how future staff utilize that. So that's of great concern. So it's something that I'm very focused on because I would like to encourage my state historic preservation officer not to sign this historic property treatment plan 1 and 2. I do not feel that consultation. I feel it should be terminated after 5 years on the behalf of the State Historic Preservation Office. I ask, has this consultation been in good faith? And the answer is no. I attended a Zoom meeting on September 6th. It was requested by my State Historic Preservation Office that all consulting parties be included. And we were not able to ask questions. We had to type them in the chat on Zoom, and we could not read them. And it was identified during that meeting that the questions weren't being answered. So that's why regular everyday people should be in the room. That's extremely upsetting. And again, it might be easy for me to find this out in Wyoming because I've been here and I've been involved, but this is happening in other places as well. But I am happy to report when state historic preservation officers are receptive, like they were in Idaho, the state historic preservation officer terminated they terminated consultation is the phrase. They didn't sign their historic property treatment plan. So in some places you have wonderful outcomes. That's why this process, that's why the National Environmental Protection Act is supposed to involve the public. That is why the National Historic Preservation Act is to involve the public. That's why this is so important.
That's what a lot of people kind of don't understand with all these projects. There's so much to lose, very little to gain in the grand scheme of things. I was telling you, Anne, when we were first interacting and when we met you at your lovely abode, that this is happening all over. Lava Ridge is a case study which we helped bring to light more with our reporting, and we got some national response through the involvement of different stakeholders we spoke to, lots of media attention over that. And I wish the media cared about all cases like that, especially what's transpiring in your situation too, because you lose so much with these scalable utility scale onshore wind projects, and you can't get back that land. You can't get back that heritage. You can't get back those.
No, you can drive through solar and wind on the way to Yellowstone. I've had this conversation. So when I've been told, by groups, well, we love golden eagles, but we just took a brief detour. We're really focused on the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I have to take a deep breath because that's why I started the Conservancy and explain and educate. Wildlife is migratory. The heaviest concentration of breeding pairs of golden eagles is in my county, in the entire United States. That exists in my county. When they die in my county, they will not exist in other migratory areas. The highest concentration of migratory birds that overwinter, golden eagles, is in my county. So what impacts me impacts everyone. It impacts people who belong to nonprofits that are focused on birds, who love birds. When my migratory birds die and they can't breed, That impacts everybody's birds. Migratory wildlife is shared. Ecosystems are important. Ecosystems are shared. We all get the health benefits of having ecosystems. Biodiversity is good for us when we have heavy development in concentrated areas, contiguous development of 21 large-scale maritime height wind energy projects, associated transmission lines, and now solar, that will have impacts that affect everyone because of migratory wildlife, because of high desert ecosystem in this case. But we talk about green space. We can't just develop every inch of the planet. That just is not successful.
And as we round out the conversation, where would you like to direct listeners to follow you in your efforts? Because I think it's invaluable what you're doing, and I would like to send more people your way. Maybe someone listening could help shine a light closer to you, in addition to what we're trying to do here and also with our forthcoming Conservation Nation report.
Definitely. I have an Albany County Conservancy website. It's albanycountyconservancy.org. And the email for the Conservancy is albanycountyconservancy@gmail.com.
Any social media?
Yes. So there is an Albany County Conservancy Facebook page and an Instagram. And then we do have our pet project. We have a Why Wind Here Facebook page and Instagram.
Fabulous. We will be sure to include all the links that you've mentioned appropriate to your work in Albany County, and also just general awareness so people could get up to speed. Is there anything else you want to impart to the audience before we finish our conversation today, Anne?
Yes. So there's power in numbers. So first, get involved and find out who's involved in your area that's focused on the issues that affect you, the wildlife you care about, the open spaces you care about, right? But think of the power of all these nonprofits that are smaller, that are actually making a huge difference. Today, I have a deadline, and I need to finish a protest to the Bureau of Land Management regarding that solar environmental impact statement. They added Wyoming to all those states for solar development. And I'm submitting letter with another nonprofit called the Range and Basin Watch.
Yeah, they're a good group. I've seen their stuff too.
So it gets to, don't be discouraged. It's actually wonderful. You can't have nonprofits function so effectively when they've been around 30 to 50 years. I mean, just look at your own school board or maybe your local baseball league. I have 3 kids. So, I look at the transitions that come and go as we get different parents in charge of our hockey program, our baseball program. Sometimes you have really effective boards and sometimes you don't. And so I tend to say when you have these smaller nonprofits, they tend to be very effective and they tend to care. And sometimes when you have these large nonprofits, they get lost in what's really important.
Small groups definitely can be more effective than some bigger powerhouse ones. And know that what you're doing, and to help conserve your county and the surrounding counties of Wyoming, doesn't go unnoticed. It was wonderful getting to know your story now that we could revisit. Equally wonderful to catch up with you. And I hope this can get shared far and wide and people will learn more about your story and find ways to help you. So I hope.
And it's fun. And I extend the offer. If you're coming to Yellowstone, you're probably going to be on the I-80 corridor or the Highway 287 corridor, unless you're entering from Montana. So I definitely am in your path. Stop in Laramie, have a cup of coffee, enjoy downtown Laramie, because Gabriella could tell you it's a really charming place and it's easy to navigate. It's literally just a pit stop. And I would love to meet you.
Yes, Anne is always opening her door. She's one of the friendliest people you'll meet. And we will encourage everyone to follow all the appropriate links and just read up on the story. it's one of many cases happening all across the country, especially out west, where people still love the wildness and kind of charm offensive of that, the allure of things that are still running wild and not overly developed. And that's something we need to maintain and keep. But it's funny that people purporting to be environmentalists don't seem to agree with that. So Anne, thank you so much for coming on. And any way we can help you, let us know.
Thanks a lot. Have a great weekend, everybody.
If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.